ECW is still well and truly beloved today, almost a quarter of a century since it ran its last show. There is plenty of nostalgia for the Philadelphia-based promotion, which captured the zeitgeist during the mid to late 90s and offered a genuine alternative thanks to the mad scientist genius of head honcho Paul Heyman. There were a lot of great characters, moments, and matches that made ECW stand out and linger so long in the memory. There were also, however, plenty of awful matches that might trick you into thinking ECW stood for extremely crappy wrestling. I'm Adam Pacitti from Cultaholic Wrestling, and these are the 10 worst ECW matches. Join us. Number 10, the Triple Threat vs. Sabu, Taz, and Rob Van Dam at November to Remember 1998. There was no shortage of talent in the main event of the 1998 November to Remember. Individually, Sabu, Rob Van Dam, Taz, Shane Douglas, Bam Bam Bigelow, and Chris Candido were great and were liable to steal the show on any given night. So, what the hell happened here then? The six of them must have all had a collective off night in this headliner, which started off with some semblance of psychology and strategy, the heels isolating Sabu and working over his injured neck, but quickly degenerated into a disjointed mess where it looked as if nobody had a clue what they were supposed to be doing. There are a couple of spectacular moments to savor, such as RVD's big flip dive from the top rope into the crowd, but there was no rhyme or reason to 85% of what they did out there, and it very obviously fell apart, never to recover. Everyone involved knew it too, and there was reportedly a confrontation that almost turned physical backstage afterwards as Douglas, who was hampered by elbow issues, ended up storming out of the building. Number 9, Just Incredible and Jack Victory vs. Tommy Dreamer and Jake Roberts at November to Remember 1998. Since ECW were in New Orleans for the 98 November to Remember pay-per-view, they felt it was only right to bring in some legends from the old Mid-South promotion. And that's why Jake the Snake Roberts teamed up with Tommy Dreamer in a tag match that looked pretty bad on paper, yet was somehow so much worse in execution. It didn't get off to a great start, with Victory badly breaking his leg within the first minute of the match, causing Jason, part of Just Incredible's ludicrous ringside entourage, which also included Chastity, Nicole Bass, and Lance Wright, to fill in for him. Jake, who was not having the best time of his life during this era, showed up in jogging bottoms and, bizarrely, a Wigan Warriors rugby jersey. It was competent, if not exactly inspiring enough when Dreamer and Credible were in there, but it quickly descended into a farcical, nonsensical brawl with a bunch of run-ins before Roberts put the match out of its misery with the predictable DDT. Number 8, Shane Douglas vs. Al Snow at Wrestlepalooza 1998. 1998's Wrestlepalooza is generally regarded as one of the worst pay-per-views ECW ever put on. A night of bad booking and bad matches was capped off by, what else? A bad main event. In it, Al Snow challenged Shane Douglas for the ECW World title. Snow had been loaned back to ECW from WWE as part of their talent trading agreement and, thanks to the popularity of Head, became a true cult hero. Regrettably, the match peaked with Snow's entrance, which was aided by techno music and a couple of thousand polystyrene heads given to the audience. Once the excitement of that had worn off, those same enthusiastic fans had to watch the two wrestlers sleepwalk their way through a sloppy, disjointed match that ended with a resounding thud when the franchise retained following loads of interference. Given that Douglas was obviously injured and thus limited, while Snow was on a real hot streak and genuinely over, there really should have been a title change here. Hilariously, the ECW locker room paraded both men around the ring on their shoulders after, as if they just had some 5-star classic. Just to reiterate, they hadn't. It was a shambles, especially for a pay-per-view main event. Number 7, New Jack vs. Bam Bam Bigelow at Wrestlepalooza 1998. Sticking with Wrestlepalooza 98, and a match that may not have been as disappointing as the main event, but one which was even more amateurish in its execution. Look, New Jack was a performer very much of his time and place and really wouldn't have worked anywhere other than ECW, where fans responded well to his particular brand of manic violence. Good for those in the arena, and those in attendance at Wrestlepalooza did respond to his stuff, but it was oftentimes torturous to watch New Jack matches from home. partly because they weren't really matches, rather an excuse for him and his opponent to hit each other with weapons over and over again until it was time for Jack to jump from someplace high. You would hope that a superior worker like Bam Bam Bigelow could elevate New Jack's shtick to make it more palatable, but that was not the case here. New Jack brought Bam Bam right down to his rock bottom level with a sloppy, lethargic brawl that completely defied logic and found both men committing two of the most obvious blade jobs you've ever seen, before the Beast from the East won with his Greetings from Asbury Park piledriver, which didn't come close to touching the mat. Number 6, The Sandman vs. Just Incredible vs. Steve Corino at Guilty as Charged 2001. The Hardys, the Dudleys, and Edge and Christian raised the bar very high with the first ever TLC match at SummerSlam 2000. Could Steve Corino, Just Incredible, and The Sandman match it when they clashed in a tables, ladders, chairs, and canes bout at what turned out to be ECW's last ever pay-per-view? Well, it's on this list, so what do you think? The triple threat weapons-based brawl for the King of Old School's ECW title was uninspired, botchy, and heatless as the three men just meandered around going from spot to spot, many of which didn't make a lick of sense. For example, when the Sandman got Irish whipped towards the ropes and decided to just jump over the top of them and dive straight through a ringside table. They were also hampered by the flimsy ladders, one of which completely buckled under Sandman's weight, underscoring the slipshod presentation. They finally brought a proper ladder into the ring, allowing old Sandy to climb up and win the gold, finally waking up a crowd who had been bored by this underpass stunt show. Oh, and then Rhino ran out and beat him in an impromptu title match, rendering the whole thing even more meaningless. Number 5, Shane Douglas vs. Pitbull number 2 at Barely Legal 1997. Barely Legal 1997 was the biggest night in ECW's history to that point. The Cult promotion was finally on pay-per-view and had stuffed the card for the occasion, booking a Terry Funk title bout, the long-awaited grudge match between Sabu and Taz, and much more. One match that had a ton of storyline behind it and stakes to make it interesting was Shane Douglas's TV title defense against Pitbull number 2. The franchise had broken Pitbull number 1's neck and tormented him during the healing process leading up to Barely Legal, where the stipulation was that a masked man who had been stalking Douglas would have to unmask if Pitbull number 2 didn't win the title. Plenty of intrigue then, but sadly nowhere near enough talent or ability to follow through successfully. This boring 20-minute slog had a shocking lack of heat and presented a clear style clash that resulted in mistimed or otherwise completely botched moves and sequences, not helped by Pitbull number 2 getting noticeably winded late on. Heyman reportedly apologized afterwards for giving this tribe 20 whole goddamn minutes. I mean, it's not the worst of your sins, Paul, but we certainly appreciate the sentiment. Number 4, Shane Douglas vs. Tully Blanchard in the ECW arena. Something a bit different now, as every other match on our countdown is available for you to watch and heckle at your discretion. This one, however, is not, and there's a reason for that. Because I'm sure that if this match between Shane Douglas and Tully Blanchard was even halfway decent, Paul Heyman would have found a way to monetize it. The franchise was defending his title against the former Horseman in what was Tully's ECW debut. Blanchard had essentially been out of the business for close to 5 years at this point, so naturally he was asked to go to a 1-hour time limit draw with Douglas. Mental. Needless to say, he did not have the wind for it, and reports from those who were there suggest he was completely out of gas after just 10 minutes. That resulted in the rest of the match being filled with rest holds as fans quickly turned on the total lack of action. Not that the two men even made it to the magical hour mark anyway, because time was called at 43 minutes. Judging by what has been written about this legendarily bad bout, shaving off 17 minutes might have just been a mercy killing. Number 3, Axel Rotten vs. Ian Rotten at Hardcore Heaven 1995. Rotten by name and rotten by nature, the tag team of kayfabe siblings Axel and Ian, who were known as the Bad Breed, eventually broke up and feuded with one another, leading to an infamous match at Hardcore Heaven 1995. The Type A deathmatch saw the two men put superglue on fists, which they then dipped into broken glass. Any pretense of actual wrestling is thrown right out of the window, not that anybody was expecting hip tosses and headlock takeovers with these two, as they proceeded to use the sharp shards to maim one another. And that's good news if you're a sadist, yet the match not only manages to be off-puttingly gruesome, but boring to boot. They try to inject some excitement into proceedings with a teased premature finish and some run-ins, but the sight of two knackered blokes trying to lamp each other like drunks in a pub car park quickly gets tiresome. This match has rightfully earned a degree of infamy due to the stipulation and the bloodletting, but just because it's infamous doesn't actually mean it's any good. Number 2, New Jack vs Mustafa at Living Dangerously 1999. Like the Bad Breed, the Gangsters tag team of New Jack and Mustafa were two brawlers who probably didn't know a wrist lock from a "let me stab you in the eye with this fork." That's how the expression goes, isn't it? Jack especially relied on twatting people with various bits of plunder in bouts that didn't really come close to resembling professional wrestling contests. The high point of Gangsters matches were the theme music that played while they dished out their version of Street Justice, which was often capped off with one of New Jack's reckless balcony dives. The two had a short feud when Mustafa briefly returned to the promotion in 1999, culminating in a match at Living Dangerously. Considering how their matches as a tag team went, it was not a surprise to see this outing consist of them battering each other with inanimate objects and, well, little else. Seriously, this was one guy hitting the other, then the other guy hitting him back until New Jack unconvincingly gaffer-taped Mustafa to a table for his big dive, which he came up short on. This resulted in him having to be carried back into the ring so that he could officially win the match in the most anticlimactic way possible. Number 1, Sabu vs the Sandman at November to Remember 1997. The 1997 November to Remember was a night to forget for Sandman and Sabu, who pretty much disgraced their profession with their efforts in a tables and ladders match. Look, there was often a charm to the recklessness that both men displayed in their matches, which played into their characters as a mute wild man and a sloppy drunk respectively, but absolutely nothing came off in this one, which was just a series of terribly executed high spots and stunts that got really old really quickly. And that is obviously a problem when a match, if you want to call it that, lasts for 20 friggin' minutes. As was typical for the penny-pinching promotion, ECW spared all the expense when it came to the props, resulting in flimsy hardware that crumpled under the slightest contact. That obviously doesn't help matters, but the complete lack of coherence begins to make a bit more sense when you know that Sandman was under the influence of some particularly potent LSD at the time, and I'm not talking about Little Spike Dudley. I would say that if anybody out there needs an especially effective anti-drug deterrent, then this utter disaster should suffice.